Hi, I'm Amanda, and welcome to Mental Health Mondays. And of course, Mental Health Mondays is where we talk about advocacy, resources, and ending the stigma associated with mental health. Today is the day you've all been waiting for. It is where we're going to be doing our PTSD versus CPTSD video. This is going to be informational, but I'm also going to try to make it as mentally stimulating as possible for you guys, because there's a lot of information that we have to get through, so hold tight. Now, a lot of the information that I got for this video comes from a podcast that I like to listen to called Complex Trauma Recovery. So we will link that down in the description for you guys. It is around a 30-minute, really easy listening type of podcast. So if you want to send it to a family member or listen to it for yourself because you're curious, or show it to your therapist, please do that. A lot of the information that I talk about is directly referenced from that podcast. So let's get started. The main difference between PTSD and CPTSD is that PTSD is actually in the DSM-5, CPTSD is not. PTSD was coined and founded around the 1970s, so there's a lot of extensive research and a lot of knowledge on PTSD because it's been around for so long. With CPTSD, it's actually only been around since around 1992, where Judith Herman founded and coined the idea of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. But we know a lot about it. It is heavily researched in the trauma arena, so definitely go look for that research if you're curious. The difference between PTSD and CPTSD is the fact that that trauma in CPTSD lasts longer than PTSD. The main similarities between PTSD and CPTSD are as follows. Hypervigilance, where you're always on call, you're always looking over your shoulder, you're always worried something's going to happen, you're very activated. Sense of perceived threat, you're always thinking there's going to be a threat, or there's specific instances where you perceive a threat. Avoidance, where you completely avoid the thing that caused you a trauma. So if you get into a car wreck, then you just avoid cars altogether. And flashbacks. Flashbacks are something that both PTSD sufferers and CPTSD sufferers experience. However, they manifest very differently between each one. With PTSD, the flashbacks are a lot more visual. Because it happens with an event, and you remember that specific event, those flashbacks are really visual. Sometimes they can be connected to a physical, but a lot of times with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, you don't always have a solidified memory of the event, especially if you experience childhood developmental trauma. When you experience that trauma as a child, sometimes your brain represses that information and you don't even remember the trauma that you experienced. But your body, however, does remember that trauma, does remember the feelings that came with the trauma, and so your flashbacks will look a lot differently. They will look a lot more physical than they will visual. So with PTSD, let's go with the car wreck example. Whenever you're in a car or you're driving fast or somebody cuts you off, maybe your flashback will consist of seeing that car wreck, or maybe a car will speed by you really fast and you'll see the car crash happen before your eyes over and over again. With CPTSD, a flashback may look more physical. Maybe something you experience in your life brings up these very visceral somatic reactions in your body, and you're not sure where that specific reaction comes from, and so you'll feel it a lot more emotionally and physically than you will visually, because a lot of times the memory isn't there. The additional criteria that makes CPTSD different than PTSD, there's normally dysregulation in 3 different arenas, right? So it's emotional, self, and attachment. So maybe you have emotional dysregulation, specific things make you feel very activated, or maybe people have told you you're overreacting about a certain situation. There's also a dysregulated sense of self, where your identity isn't specifically solid. And there's also attachment dysregulation. This is where attachment styles come in, and you're really insecurely attached. Maybe you're a little bit codependent, things like that. And those are the main differences between PTSD and CPTSD. Now, CPTSD is most often found in childhood, when you experience trauma over a long period of time during your developmental years, where your body and your mind has to adapt to the trauma in the moment. So a lot of times people refer to CPTSD as a brain injury instead of a mental illness, because of the fact that your brain has to adapt to that specific trauma. A lot of people who struggle with CPTSD struggle with a sense of self, because when you experience PTSD, you have who you were before the trauma and who you were after the trauma. With childhood trauma and complex post-traumatic stress disorder from your childhood, oftentimes that sense of self is so distorted because they don't really know what their sense of self is. There was no before the trauma or after the trauma. CPTSD and PTSD don't affect two people in the same way. It affects everyone very differently, especially if you have CPTSD as a result of childhood trauma. If you had a caregiver who was attentive to your needs, oftentimes you can come out of that situation not even having CPTSD. It really just depends on your specific circumstance, your genetics, and your environment. You know, nature versus nurture. And as always, we always want to recommend that you talk to your therapist, your mental health care professional, and your care team if you think that either one of these diagnoses fit for you. It took a really long time for me to get my CPTSD diagnosis because of the fact not all of the professionals that I went to were trauma informed in that area. So I would personally suggest for you to get somebody who is trauma informed so they know the differences between CPTSD, PTSD, ADHD, BPD, all of the mental illnesses criterias. If you would like to learn more about CPTSD and complex trauma in general, please go listen to the podcast Complex Trauma Recovery, because there's a lot of really great information in that podcast that will really keep you informed on CPTSD, PTSD, and all of the manifestations of each. We're here to end the stigma behind both of those, and they're very real and very present disorders that a lot of us experience. If you want more information on this, please talk to your mental health care provider. That's always something that we suggest, always something we want you to do. Never take this information as a diagnosis. You are in charge of your recovery. Advocate for yourself, take care of yourself, and we will see you next week where we will talk about repression versus suppression. Bye, y'all. Is that good?
That was good. Yeah, okay. That was good. Yeah, cool. Yeah, there's gonna be, there's stuff maybe, I could probably, and there's a possibility that, when I do, and so there is. So yeah, it's good.